Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Sarah Krasnostein. Sarah is the author of The Believer, Encounters with the Beginning, the End, and Our Place in the Middle, from Tin House, and it's going to be released in the United States on March 1st. Sarah's first book was the award-winning The Trauma Cleaner. So, The Believer starts off with a Mennonite choir on a subway platform. It's actually kind of the spark of this book. And the idea of belief, what gives rise to it, how it remains stable, and how it's a trigger warning for many of us. There's 6 different stories in the book. My favorite is the one of Annie, and the death doula, and Katrina, a lovely woman, and that could be a book in itself. And it's about those who, for another example, who, notwithstanding clear science, believe that the Earth, the universe for that matter, was created in 6,000 years. And we meet ghost hunters, UFO enthusiasts, an imprisoned woman who should not be where she is, but makes the best of it, and the aforementioned Mennonites, whose hub remains about a 20-minute drive from where I sit right now. It's outside of Philadelphia. So the disparity of these believers, the disparity of these believers and their beliefs is not really disparity at all. And Sarah demonstrates a style that's kind of a hit on the head, that we are believers too, and that we all share, voluntarily or not, the ideal of belief. So welcome, Sarah. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So why is it The Believer, not believers? Why is it not a believer? Because if it's in the singular, you have 6 stories here, yes. And yet the title, and then we'll get into the subtitle too, because as a bookseller, titles, covers, subtitles, epigraphs, which we can also talk about, really make a difference. So yeah. Why The Believer?
So that was very deliberate, because even though the book has 6 different stories that I braid together, my intention was that they would create a 7th story, which would be my personal story of why I'm there to begin with, why I'm interested in these stories at all, and how over time I increasingly come to see myself in the lives of these very different others. So if I can be a believer alongside them, and kind of bridge that distance, I'm hopeful that readers who might have a different initial reaction to people who hold these beliefs might be able to come along for a little bit longer by seeing themselves in me as well. So the believer is me, but in a sense, it's all of the people I'm interviewing, and it's all of the people who are reading the book. It's all of us.
Well, that first, like, there's a knee-jerk response that I think many readers have, like, it would be like if you did a flat earther, one of those, and I'd go, how stupid is that? I mean, how can they possibly believe this? And then I think, well, you're supposed to be able, as I think you said before, of holding 2 competing ideas in your head at the same time, Anyway, so, okay, let's talk about the subtitle, Encounters with the Beginning, the End, and Our Place in the Middle. Why?
So, I was on this book for 4 years, researching and immersing myself, as much as I was welcome, into the lives of each of these people. And I knew that I didn't want to write separate stories. I knew that the arc that I was seeing there was a book arc and not a magazine piece. And I didn't quite know until I kept coming back and returning and digging a little deeper with each of them, what exactly was attracting me to them and why I was feeling the same kind of vibe from each of the stories. They were all making the same sound to me, even though they had nothing to do with each other. These people are incredibly different. And over the years, what was revealed to me was that their beliefs had to do with this kind of human longing for things to be different. And it was a longing about the ineluctable ineluctably crappy parts of being alive. I don't think that's the technical term, but it covers it. The things that we can't kind of wish away, death, illness, certain forms of injustice, uncertainty. And so really the problem that they were up against and that we're all up against is how we, live a spacious life when we know that our time is limited. And so it became about those questions: how to live, how to die, what we do with the time in the middle. And kind of those are the fundamental questions in a way of all literature. But they were very much kind of foundational when these people were talking about the things that they believed in, either explicitly or kind of underneath the words in the emotional reality that they were kind of confronting.
You think I've always thought that we're in the middle all the time.
I thought so too, but then with Annie, who's the Buddhist death doula in the book, and Katrina, who she's helping to have the most peaceful death possible. Katrina wanted to die unmedicated at home, which is much harder than it sounds. And when I was that close to somebody who was actively dying, suddenly we're not in the middle anymore. And then you realize that maybe we're never in the middle.
Well, if you ever become my surrogate for my advance directive, please do not play any Celine Dion.
Noted.
That'd be horrible. Horrible way to go.
Unless you want to speed the process up.
Yeah, it would work. It's like how I think recently, how they did with Noriega and play those songs, play the music at 130 decibels. It's kind of like that. Yeah. So, okay, as a bookseller, I'll go to the third. Oh no, we didn't talk about the cover. And the cover in Australia is completely different.
Yeah. Very different covers, which is interesting.
So Australia is this candle burning out, and we have this spiral, this black spiral that kind of literally and figuratively draws you in.
Yeah. It's I like that. It looks kind of like a record, but it's the eye. And I have a quote from Emerson towards the end of the book about the circles of life that start off with, the subjective eye, and then it broadens out from there, and into a very eloquent description of the circle of life, which Emerson does much better than me because he's Emerson. But it's a cover by the artist by J.M. Maselli, and it's just beautiful. So it's very striking.
Yeah.
But as an author, you kind of have to disinvest in your covers a little bit because it takes us up to 100,000 words to do what these designers can do with one image, and that's why we need them. But it's very funny, kind of this discovery of what your work looks like visually. It's a big reveal to you as much as anyone else. And I've been very lucky with my covers so far. I love them all.
Yes, yeah, it's whether it should be or not, a picture tells 1,000 words, and never judge a book by its cover. That doesn't work. And that's why it's always good to leave it to the publishers, because they want very badly, more than you, to sell the book.
That's true. And it is a marketing device. And we are, it's no use being precious as a writer, because we are all readers and we are attracted to covers that we're attracted to. So it definitely does have that effect.
Oh yeah, and also the other thing that was really good about the cover is you have that blurb from James Gleick, which is amazing.
Yeah,
I interviewed him for the his recent book about time travel.
Oh, wow.
He was a great guy. So do you know him? Did he read the book and say, "Hey, I love it," or something like that?
Oh no, that was through my publisher. I would have been very much too shy, and no, but he was very generous, and of course, as a fan of his work, that was very. It was a big boost.
That's great. A great blurb. Okay, so I still haven't gotten to the first page of your book. Here's the first page. So the epigraph is from, when you're reading the book, at first, I didn't know whether you were talking about you or we were still talking about them, which was kind of cool. And like I said in the beginning about hitting you in the head. And so like the epigraph, I'm trying to think, okay, it's here, I'll read it. The great themes are love and death. Their synthesis is the will to live, and that is what this book is about. So he's saying what his book is about. So I guess your book is about it too.
Yeah, and maybe all books are about that in the end.
Okay, but why? How does that tie into belief?
Yeah. So and with each of these stories, and I think with most of our beliefs, they're filling. If you think of them as certainties in the absence of proof, what their function is to unite kind of this divide between the world as it is with all those crappy parts and the world that we'd like it to be. And we, would like to think we have more time with those we love. We'd like to think that, we'll have, infinite health and longevity to enjoy the good parts of being alive and embrace, the world. But we come up against the truth that that's not how it is all the time. And so how do we find the energy and the impetus to live as fully as possible in light of that knowledge? So between, death and love of whatever you love, we do a lot of magic making in our head, and that's an enormous superpower, but it can also be an enormous dividing force. And how we kind of work in that space is, we do it kind of in groups and tribes, and we have, collectively held beliefs, but we also have these very intricate personal narratives. And that kind of way of making things work, making things more bearable, giving life meaning is such an essentially human feature that I think we're seeing it every time we open a book, every time someone shares their life with you, how they're finding the will to live. So yeah, it's a personal interest of mine.
And again, what's really good about it is at first the epigraph, or lots of places in the book, you're wondering, well, why does this mesh with these 6 stories? And what's good for the reader is, you have to think. The reader has to think, and then after the book is over, the reader still has to think. And that's my favorite. But
well,
go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I like, because I'm a craft nerd, I appreciate most in the books that I'm reading, questions of technique, and with whatever I'm writing that has a longer form. I like the form to mirror the content. So in this book, I wanted to provide, it's all inherently selective and partial, as nonfiction always is, but I do my best to reflect the reality of each of these situations and each of these different contexts. And if the reader comes away trying to actively make their own meanings from what they've read and what they've been exposed to, then that is, on a personal level, mirroring not only what the people in the book have been doing with the materials of life, but the notion of what we do with belief more abstractly. So it's on a micro version, kind of a smaller version of the concept at large.
If you wanted to say which of these stories would cause the least, for want of a better word, controversy with you and your reader, Annie's story, you don't have to reach anywhere, it's not like the earth is flat. It's real truth, at least to me. So in allowing you to talk instead of me talking all the time, tell Annie's story.
So Annie is a woman who lives in Australia in her 60s, and she's been a practicing Tibetan Buddhist for the last 40 years. And she is a survivor of sexual violence and physical abuse and childhood neglect and abandonment. And until she kind of embarked upon Buddhism in her life, she had a very difficult time, to put it gently. And what she's done with those kind of 4 decades of learning is use it at the service of people who are dying. And I didn't know when I first found out about this work, that it existed at all. I was in my mid 30s when I read the words death doula. And I knew about doulas because I have 2 children, and I knew that they help women in labor bring life into the world. Death doula is just the inverse of that. They help people die comfortably and will do all of the tasks that are required, whatever that person needs, whether it's, the administrative stuff with the hospital or doctors, or more personal things with the family, or just physically making you more comfortable, or teaching you how to come to terms with this in your mind. Her skill set, is so diverse, and she can tailor it to each person. She doesn't call them clients, but, she's very enmeshed in their lives. And so I was just staggered by this. We don't talk about death, the practicalities of death. I mean, other stories in this book involve ghost hunting and, ufology. And for the people that are, going to go and buy works of literary nonfiction, there's a certain kind of expected narrative around how we deal with those beliefs. And kind of we're united in seeing certain facts as alternative facts or fake news. But when it comes to the practicalities of our own deaths, like the one certainty, we have this wishful silence that we drape over it. And so there is a degree of magical thinking in that, we can deal with all the other practicalities of our lives, but often our death is a shock, or, something that comes too soon, something we don't prepare for. And Annie's always normalizing this in conversation. And it's incredibly confronting when she refers to your eventual death, or when she, talks about how beautiful a body looked, or when she just, her day involves all of these practical things that are dreadful to most of us. And she's genuinely well with the work that she does. She's not morbid at all. And she's made space for it in her life, as she has made space for so many other bad parts of what her experience, without letting them kind of dominate the narrative or her emotional reality. So I was really taken with this framework for living. Can we be sufficiently unattached to those we love to pass peacefully into our death and talk about it in a normal way, like we talk about what we're having for dinner? Can we make peace with our own mortality? Is it even possible? And kind of what do we have to go through in life to be that unattached? So, the difference, I guess, between Annie's story and many of the other stories in the book is that she had a story that she told herself about why we're here and what to do with the time. But it was so elastic and so spacious that she didn't need to reason away all of these other things. Death didn't need to be a punishment. It didn't need to be, a transactional exercise. It could be scary or unfair or unjust. And that could just be okay. It didn't need to be explained away. And I thought that if we're going to tell ourselves stories, if we're wired for meaning making, let it be a story like that, because it doesn't divide us. It's a safety seeking story that doesn't hurt anybody. And actually, at the end of the day, makes us so much more powerful.
Yeah, and this story is the only one in which, at least in my opinion, there is a person who makes these beliefs true, and that's Katrina. And the words, your words about Katrina, I think, tell me how much you loved, admired, and respected her. The way that she handled things with such poise, especially like when you said like her sandals and her pink toenails, those kinds of things, and the manner in which her advanced directive was structured and her living wake. It's almost like she's the heroine of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I feel there's something, I mean, not in the religious sense, but it was a holy experience to be close to that, in the sense of being near the human mystery, whatever that is. She had a remarkable energy, and she was unlike anyone I'd ever met. So I read in the book how I didn't realize that I didn't understand what it took to do Annie's work, because we had been in constant conversation over 2 years by this point, and she's very forthcoming. And, we had spoken, so I thought I understood. But until I could see her in action, in her work, helping somebody who was dying, all the way through to the end. I didn't understand the emotional reality of what it took to do that work. I had not seen a dead body before. Katrina was the first dead person that I saw, was alone with. And to be that close to someone in an intimate moment in the family when they're dealing with it, you can see, as you said, that these beliefs are actualized. They're not just things that exist in a purely intellectual or spiritual realm. They are guiding and governing behavior and making things better than they would have otherwise been. So yeah, no, in that sense, it crossed over from, pure belief to something that was actually a much more practical matter.
Yes. You give us quotes from time to time, whether it's Louis Casolino or Martin Buber. I reminded when I was started reading it, I remember the book by Eric Hoffer, The True Believer.
Yeah.
But that's your book, mine is true. But his was a book about how mass hysteria, mass movements, kind of like what's happening in the United States today. But you distill it down to individuals, and you never have anyone who is essentially proselytizing to you or trying to convert you. Like when you said to we got to talk about the ark, but when you're in the ark and they ask you, so have you accepted Jesus? And you go, no, I'm Jewish. And she goes, okay. Just
Yeah, maybe it's something about me. I feel like, what's wrong with me? You should proselytize to me. No, but yeah, it's such an amazing book. The most remarkable thing about True Believer is that it was written in 1951. Yeah, and it has a freshness that he could have written it today. And what I think is interesting, and it's not just America, it's I think all Western democracies at the moment, is that we've always been deeply invested in an individualized notion of psychopathology. And we don't like to see how these personal pains and kind of the messy accords we've made with our pasts and the different personal dysfunctions translate into our collective life and our political life. The furthest it seems that we're willing to accept is it affects us on a one-on-one relationship level, but not, guiding voting behavior or guiding news consumption or, support for the justice system. So when you start to look at the ways in which these personal pains translate into collective action, his thesis, that our susceptibility to influence is always there and heightened in times of anxiety is very relevant now. But perhaps it's always been relevant when you look at everything that humans had done to each other before then and everything that has happened after. This is the kind of water we swim in.
Let me ask you a question about, well, I'll start with something you've talked about in other interviews. Talk about, and I have a follow-up on that basically, which is why did you decide to write this book in the first person?
Oh, right. Yeah. So, well, firstly, I only have one voice. That's what it is. I'm a first person dude. Everything I was reading before I wrote professionally was from that school of narrative nonfiction. And it continues to be what I gravitate towards. And it's how I most naturally write. But ethically, I am invested in the first person. I receive criticism from time to time that it's an incredibly narcissistic way of writing, insinuating yourself into the story, making it about you, et cetera, et cetera. And I always respond to that the most narcissistic thing would be the third person, this all-seeing eye of God, infallible, impartial, just isness. I don't agree with that. We're always right. We're always selecting. We're including things, we're eliminating things, we're seeing only through our own eyes. And that's the work of factual writing. And if I can make that clear, that selectivity and subjectivity clear by reminding you that, it is I who am writing this, another fallible human, then I do think in the task of nonfiction, which is, converting the CCTV camera footage of life into the story of life that can fit into a book or an article, it is much more honest if you're reminding people that, you're just as partial as anyone else. And you're there on the page going through the story with them.
If I was in your position, researching and writing this book as kind of like a reporter, there would have been times that I would have argued. If I'm talking to someone who's really, really smart, really, really nice, has degrees in geology, and he says with 100% faith and knowledge that the world, the universe was created 6,000 years ago, I would kind of get into a fight with him. Did you ever do that, or did you consciously say, I'm not going to be, no matter what happens, there's not going to be any judgmental aspect of this work?
Well, yeah, I mean, my internal voice is kind of arcing up and saying those things, but that's not why I'm there. I mean, that's been done by others who, I guess are more qualified to do the science stuff than me. I agree with them. Bill Nye has written, at length about the Creation Museum. And, I'm interested in this, in that dialogue. And I, am very much what I consider the side of truth and fact, which is Bill Nye. But I was more curious about that whole ability to hold two diametrically opposed concepts in the mind. The fact that they are very intelligent people. They have PhDs from accredited universities. They're moms and dads. They function in the world. And yet they're saying things that most of the rest of us, by which I mean the literary nonfiction purchasers and readers, find absurd. So the absurdity was not as interesting to me as what lay underneath it. What was the motivation? What was the world like through their eyes? That's the more interesting question to me, not defeating, absurdity with science. But what common ground might we be able to find? Maybe not. Maybe it's not possible. But what's underneath it is fascinating to me. And if you can kind of get to that emotional reality, judgment becomes less interesting. It still has its place. This was before COVID, but we are still heading towards climate change, racial injustice. These ideas have real consequences that can damage and sometimes take the lives of people. So it's not something like, oh, all of us can live and let live. That's not my motivation. If anything, it's, can we find that common ground so that perhaps we might do all of this better together, rather than that initial reactive defensiveness?
It's tough wrapping this around your head, because you're talking about, in one place, you're talking about the vast indifference of the universe, which reminds me of Camus, The Stranger.
Yeah.
I think, should that be there? And then like absence of knowledge or cognitive separation between everybody, or ordinary people being the most remarkable. It's the kind of like, okay, that next we'll talk about the arc. But I mean, it's like, there's part of me that it's like in the South, now you can't mention, in Florida, you can't mention the word gay at school, or the book Mouse by Art Spiegelman being essentially banned. Shouldn't I be trying to convince somebody that the world wasn't created shouldn't that be my job, rather than just, well, okay, so enough of me again. I tend to do this.
Oh, no. So I think it's interesting. I mean, I think that it's not, if fact moved the world, we wouldn't have these problems. If it was simply a matter of logic, they wouldn't believe that. They understand facts, they understand logic. It is the thing that's driving them to hold those beliefs so closely for dear life. And so we could short circuit the conversation if we made sure we were listened to. And the way to do that is to make sure that the other person feels that you're listening to them, and B, understand the need to have those very dangerous beliefs in the first place. So Yeah, we're not going to get, I mean, if we could get anywhere by arguing about facts, we wouldn't find ourselves in the current position. And anyone opening their Facebook would know that. Like, we can't rely on people's good sense or, what's empirically clear. That's not moving the conversation. So if we try to kind of actually hold each other in a different way, then we might ensure that that stuff kind of gets through. But you have to understand the blockage in the first place. It's a very tricky thing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, if you have somebody who's incredibly intelligent and tells you that in his own area, radioactive dating is wrong.
Yeah.
And so what am I supposed to, I'm sorry, but what am I supposed to do with that? I would tell him, like, you're right. You're 100% right. I can't tell him anything.
But you could find out, what's driving him. You can find out, what kind of a kid he was, and you can find out what's happened in his career and what he wants for his children or how he behaves towards strangers. And all of these things start to reveal the conditions in which those beliefs take root. And so maybe we're never going to change that guy's mind, but maybe it better prepares us for the kids that he might influence in the future. Yeah.
Well, this is your book, and you have these stories, and yet you have these quotes, like I said, about this fact that cognitively we are so far apart. And I recognize you're not trying to say we should move together and come up with a doubly false reality, but that there's a point to be made about, just as we both said, holding these two competing ideas in your head. Is that the theme of the book?
No, I think the theme is, that goes towards the theme that we have. If we hold up a mirror to our own cognitive tendencies, we can see that it's never just a question of everyone else holding absurd beliefs and us seeing things exactly as they are, but rather the ways in which we're wired to make sense of the world around us, that we're wired for the safety of certainty over the discomfort of accurately perceiving certain situations. And that it might manifest in, one guy as a young earth or flat earth policy. But it might manifest quite differently in people that we consider reasonable, foremost amongst them ourselves. So what narratives have we been guarding and we've been protecting about ourselves or our families or relationships or the world around us, that when we really look at them are just too neat to be true? And perhaps there might be a different way of dealing with this cognitive drive and this emotional reality that would allow us to embrace a fuller life, get closer to people, and not feel this discomfort of defensiveness and the need to ruminate and justify, if we were just kind of seeing ourselves more clearly. But perhaps that's not possible.
I don't know. It's like you do give us markers. It's like you almost are highlighting your book, because like all of a sudden I'm reading Murakami saying the existential reality of non-existence. And at first that doesn't seem to have anything to do with your book, which is good. And then the reader has to say, okay, how does this touch the woman in the ark telling us what a cubit really is? Yeah. And it's hard to do. I mean, you gave us, it's like a really tough examination that we have to take.
Yeah, well, I mean, I like to respect the reader's capacity to make their own conclusions, and they might disagree with me completely, and that's all right. But, that Murakami quote, particularly the existential reality of non-existence, is kind of what drives everything. So at the Creation Museum, where they need to believe that the earth is young, because otherwise the rest of the Bible wouldn't be as certain. And if it's not certain, then death exists not as a punishment for sin, but for some unknown reason. And it's all chaos, and God isn't taking care of us. He's actually arbitrary and at times unjust. So they need these very strong logic chains. And at the bottom, what I was hearing again and again was, because if that's not true, death doesn't make sense. They need death to make sense. well, maybe the problem lies not in death, but in our conception of it. How do we, who are, fully living now, going to deal with this, single certainty that's just on the horizon? So, it translated differently in each story, but it was very much about, the stories we tell ourselves to think ourselves out of discomfort. And death is the greatest discomfort.
So you and I are both believers, and in your first person view of the universe, you are the believer and I am the believer, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Which is Buber, I think, I and thou, which is I'm
Okay.
myself and you're another I, and we're different. And if we can, get to the same place together about sharing our experiences and thoughts, that's wonderful. And if not, not. But, that's perhaps, Buber's perspective was that's where holiness resides. For Buber, that was God in relationship, in relatedness. So, that's another way of believing, perhaps what
Yeah.
we need.
But that's like basically just saying we should all follow the golden rule and just be nice to each other.
Yeah. I wish it was that simple. I would go with that. I think that's a great constitution.
I
And I'm
mean,
a lawyer. That's all the rule you need. That's good.
right. That's why I always thought your tax return should just be one page. How much money did you make? Let's give me 10% of that.
Much more sensible.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll let you talk again. Talk about the Ark and the museum, and then you can bring in Satan and the Archangel Michael creating craters on the moon.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I found out about the Creation Museum in Kentucky from the Mennonite families that I was spending the time with. And they had their corporate retreat there. They run an internet filtering business. And they were showing me photos from the previous year's trip to the Creation Museum. And I'd not heard of that. I hadn't heard of Ken Ham or the Answers in Genesis ministry. And, hopping on the website and looking at it, it was, startling to me to see not just the fact that there were accredited scientists on their staff, but that they were concerned with promoting that fact. So again, that two diametrically opposed concepts in the mind at one time. On the one hand, this was an institution that was saying there's no proof or knowledge that's greater than the literal truth of Scripture. And on the other hand, they were very loud in promoting kind of academic, secular accreditations from various universities. So it was cherry picking from, science and that framework of scientific method, but at the service of a literal scriptural understanding of the Bible. And that was intriguing to me. And when I read about the work of these scientists and things that they had written, I wanted to see what a person who could hold those two oppositions in their mind was like. What were they like as people? What their daily lives like, their offices, the way they spoke. And so I went to spend time at the museum and speak with these people. And, it's a perfectly fun place and very dystopian and absurd and dangerous in certain respects and completely normal in other respects. And, I talk about Hannah Arendt a lot in the book, and the banality of evil concept is that, things are much more bureaucratic than Gothic when you get to the beliefs that drive hatreds between us. It's just, they've got cafes and pizza places, there's field trips and parking lots. It's a very normal environment. And then, these are the beliefs that can cause incredible pain and violence when they're taken to their conclusions. So, as I said before, what I learned in those conversations, but I was not there to convince them otherwise, but it's a unique feeling when, very professional, highly qualified, articulate, and perfectly nice people, grown-ups, come back repeatedly to this idea that their God has to make sense. It has, their God is at once all powerful, but completely beholden to human rules of consistency and logic and goodness. And death had to have a reason. And therefore it could maybe be avoided if you tried hard enough or were good enough. This life was just a prelude to the next one. And it was a very kind of vulnerable, I want to say childlike, but I think that we all carry elements of that wishful thinking. I saw an element of it in, our reluctance to discuss death that Annie's always talking about. So maybe it looks different for us, but it's still that inner child saying that they don't want the party to end. And how that translates into our professional life, our personal life, our religious life is infinitely interesting to me.
This is blasphemy, but I always wanted to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, because it would be like having your own butler or valet,
That would be great.
Yeah, it would be great. But I wish I can't do it. Once you do it, your life is great, right? Once you have total faith, you don't have to really worry about anything.
Yeah. And, their big, gotcha moment that they think in this discourse is that science has room for uncertainty. Science loves, I don't know, as an answer. They love that as part of the method, that you can't be working towards proving a certain solution prospectively. You have to be kind of open to the unknown. And that was evidence to them of science's failures, where science, it's the single thing that allows us to learn anything. But again, it's uncomfortable. And, why would you choose kind of the great unknown when you could convince yourself that everything is working according to a plan and that plan is only ever good?
Yeah. It's like my hero is Richard Feynman, and he's even in your book. And, I like that part of that Nova special where he talks about, a scientist is learning how to play. He's watching two people playing chess and he thinks it has it all figured out. And then all of a sudden the king moves and the rook moves. And then he realizes they're castling, but you think you know everything about chess, and then this weird thing comes up. And so he and Einstein are both telling us the less you know, the more you know. Know, and they love failure, just like Elon Musk likes when his rockets blow up. That's how you get to rockets that don't blow up.
Yeah, but this is, I think it's also intimately tied, and this only comes out when you are lucky enough to get subjects that spend deep time with you. But when you have that kind of mentality and those values, and you speak to people for whom failure or imperfection is not an option because of how they were raised or what they've learned relationally in the world, then, you see how it starts to translate into their professional work and into their philosophical beliefs. And something that it has its origins in relationship dysfunction can also have its solutions in, better relationships, more open dialogue, less judgment. And so I'm really, the idea of perfection and, making something ironclad is very interesting to me when I hear it in conversation.
To turn that on its head, you have a woman who, again, the reader taking his own subjective point of view, you have a woman who justifiably kills her husband because she wants to save a good life for her son, and then spends exactly half of her life in prison and comes out and still, I wouldn't be this way. She comes out whole. She lives day by day. She lives in the moment. How did you find her?
So I found the woman that I call Lynn in a homeless shelter in the East Village in Manhattan, where I was doing observational research on another project. And mostly it just looked like I was watching TV in a homeless shelter, but I was there for many months at all hours of the day to see the life of this place and learn about its people. And she was remarkable because she was accorded a level of respect that other people were not. And she was at once very bright and lovely and very powerful. So, you would not take advantage of her sweetness. And it wasn't kind of a defensive sweetness. It was such an integrated way of being. And our conversations started off, slowly and then deepened over time. And what I learned is, as you said, that she was married for 35 years, lived in upstate New York. Then her abusive husband started increasing the violence towards herself and their young child. And she killed him. And so, if you didn't know her or the circumstances, you would, label her as a murderer and be done with it. But when you dig into the story, things are obviously not that simple. And the thing that struck me most was her religious practice. She is a very religious woman, Episcopalian, and her church in Lower Manhattan is a very social justice oriented place, very welcoming. And she did not hide the fact that she was, quote unquote, a murderer. And they welcomed her right away. They understood the conditions of her life in a way that was profound to me. And I thought, wouldn't that be wonderful if that was how all religions manifested? But kind of beneath that was my own, I guess, prejudice of, if that happened to me, I don't know if I could believe in a just God. How do you hold that in your mind? And, the conversations over time with her were just the most illuminating thing, because I guess I had an assumption, as I suspect that many of us do, that in order to be truly happy or light or joyful in your life, everything has to look perfect. That word again. And she was like Annie and Katrina, not at all into that story. She was like, yeah, these crappy things have happened to me. They're part of my story. I can talk about them. I can access them. I don't need to polish them into meaning. They're there and they happened. And 35 years of my life was spent inside. And that was not the life I had planned for myself in a just world. That wouldn't have been the life that I had earned through my goodwill and hard work and, diligent educational experience. But that it is what it is. And God is there for me. God, this has a larger purpose. And also, I don't need to know it. I don't need to be able to explain it to you. And she lived it. She was not an angry person. She was not a resentful person. She had a lightness to her. And I saw her over 4 years in numerous situations. And again, like Annie and like Katrina, there is a holiness, kind of a human mystery to somebody who's that comfortable in their own skin, that comfortable with death and uncertainty and injustice, that they don't need to reason it away with a perfectly polished, impenetrable story.
I was so excited because I was going to say that Lynn and Annie and Katrina were very much alike, and then you said it.
Yeah. I mean, if there's a spectrum of these stories, that they are at that end, that many of us, I think, would see ourselves in, not wish ourselves into it, but could see ourselves in, but maybe not. I mean, if the ufologists and the ghost hunters and the evangelists are at the other end of that spectrum, I think they have tendencies, not in how they've practically translated, but tendencies that the rest of us definitely have as well.
They all seem like that. It's like when, Warren Zevon's last appearance on David Letterman, and Dave says, given the fact that you're like this, what your situation is like this, what advice can you give us? And he goes, enjoy every sandwich. And
it's so, yeah, I find that very moving. Like, when I think about that, yeah, I find that very moving.
Oh, you're going to cry.
For anyone who hasn't watched it, you should go find that on YouTube, because it's very beautiful.
Yeah, it was also like when Michael Douglas had cancer, throat cancer, tongue cancer, and he came on the show and he was like ebullient and looked great. And Dave Letterman goes, how can you do this? And he goes, because it's television.
Yeah.
That's another way of looking at it. I mean, yeah, if Lynn, she's out of prison, and when we meet her, she's out of prison. She's been hired by a guy who's also a felon,
Yep.
And then
Excellent.
then she has to go back to the halfway house.
Well, yeah, so when I met her, she was living in the halfway house. And over the next few years, she was hired by the halfway house to become one of the supervisors, which entailed her moving out to a different place. But by then she had, her work. She was a paralegal. And the lawyer that she worked for was himself, an ex felon. And she had built this life for herself increasingly kind of over time on the outside, but she was definitely reduced from where she, quote unquote, should have been had all of this not happened. But yeah, when we first meet her, she's 4 months out of prison.
Another thing that was interesting to me, with my having practiced law for 30 years and you being a criminal attorney, is the way that the system manipulated the facts. And then you go think, well, you're a good attorney, I'm a good attorney, we can win. Even though the reason I never did criminal law was because I never could stomach the idea of representing someone I thought was guilty.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult, it continues to pose difficulties, although we couldn't justly put away anyone without the zealous defense. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe it sounds like a justification, but that's definitely the reality of the system as we understand it. The law at the time for women who had been subject to domestic violence was to criminalize them and traumatize them further. The police wouldn't help her. She had been assaulted in public by the husband, and people did not meaningfully intervene. She tried to physically flee, and he tracked her down. And those situations continue every day all around the world. But I think the law has too slowly, changed to view the way in which reactive defensive violence, what it looks like in a marriage or a relationship, as opposed to that traditional male on male violence that we see in the defenses of self-defense or provocation. Those abused women were not accorded the leeway. So the law has incrementally changed over time, but we still see assumptions and injustices when it comes to domestic violence on a daily basis. So we're not there yet. But it has changed, and it has changed because of people like Lynn, who are quite vocal in getting it changed.
And I was just thinking, taking your book as a template, I was just thinking, okay, you are part of the adversarial system, and the adversarial system works. It's just unpleasant at times, like, watching sausage being made. But yeah, so you can layer that on top of everything else in the book by basically saying we can disagree without being disagreeable.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. I feel like, no one's written as penetratingly about the narratives of justice than Janet Malcolm, but the point that she makes in various of her books about the law's need for certainty and black and white and very little room for ambiguity. You're either guilty or you're not. And we've been less concerned with truth and more concerned with facts that can be proven according to these evidential standards. That's just another story that we tell ourselves, because we know so many times when the law has failed to capture the reality of the human context in which people have acted. And we know from jury research that the more human context, humanizing context that people have, the less punitive they become. But the reality is that, we're pressed for time. We're in and out of court. We're meeting clients right before we have to go before a judge. I mean, the system is not built for, it's built for a particular kind of truth that is not always the truth of human action.
Yeah, it's like wolf in sheep's clothing, literally, the way Elizabeth Holmes. Yeah, Theranos, the way she changed, she wore modest clothing and changed her turtleneck and all that for when she was on the stand, and it's not right, but it's the way it works.
No, it's
Right.
yeah.
So, all right, to close out, do you have the book with you so you can show the cover?
Oh, I have. I'm still waiting on my American copy. I only have the Australian one, which is not that useful to you guys, but it should have arrived. There's just been worldwide delays with receiving our mail.
Oh, that's true. I didn't think about that. Yeah, I mean, I could show it, but it's on my iPad, and I
And
have. It was net. It's because you sent me a NetGalley.
yeah. But well, the cover's black and white. I don't know.
It's very Hitchcockian cover.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, it is. That's
like Vertigo or something like that.
yeah, Vertigo. That's it.
Well, anyway, so we've been going an hour, so that's enough, right?
Yeah, I reckon if you're good, I'm good.
Yep. Okay. Well, thanks so much. The Believer comes out March 1st, published by Tin House, and I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been fabulous, and looking at your shelves has also been very interesting to me. I'm very jealous. I wish I was there in person.
I always like when it's close enough that you can see the titles, but then I get distracted and forget what the interview is.
It's true. What was that
That's
again?
why I'm still looking at the numbers, you know.
Oh, I know. I know.
I was like John verse 1, chapter.
I'm sending a secret message. No, I'm not. Anyway, I'm not. Yeah. Oh, well,
Okay.
thank you very much. And I really appreciate your time.
You too. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.